Welcome to the Modern CPA Success Show, where we're 100% focused on helping accounting firms achieve success. If you're an accounting firm owner who wants to learn how to grow your firm by providing virtual CFO services, then this podcast is for you.
Welcome to our episode today. My name is Tom Waddleton. I am one of the facilitators for today's session. I'm a full-time virtual CFO with Summit CPA Group. My other co-facilitator, Adam Hale. Adam, hello.
Hello. Yep. Hello,
Hope
everybody.
you're doing well today. And then we're excited to have a guest today. So Brannon Poe is with us. And without giving a lot of introduction, Brannon, you want to tell us a little bit about you and career journey and what's taking you to the kind of things that are keeping you busy today?
Sure. So I started my career in public practice. I am a CPA. I started with Ernst & Young in the audit side and quickly realized I was in the wrong place. And
I think most people are, you said Ernst & Young and audit, so that pretty much solidifies that. I think everybody is probably in agreement. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually left and went to work for a smaller kind of mid-sized firm and did some tax work. And just, I spent about 5-6 years in public and just realized I'm probably not best suited for public. I wanted to do sales work. And so I actually went into a different industry for a little while. I went into a kind of construction related industry, did sales and learned sales and really enjoyed it. And then found the career I'm in now, which is brokering CPA firms in 2003. And that was a great way to marry my accounting experience with my sort of like of sales work. And so I've been selling firms since 2003. And then in 2020, we launched a virtual workshop for CPA firm owners called Accounting Practice Academy.
Oh, well. What do you do in what's the purpose of the workshop?
So the workshop is, really it sort of targets that smaller CPA firm owner. I'd say 1 to 5 million in revenue is our target. Okay. And what we do is go back to fundamentals. By the time you get to $1 million in revenue, your practice might have become a little, scattered, unfocused. And so we use a lot of the data-driven analysis tools that we use on our brokerage business to help owners of firms kind of see their firm from a high-level, almost buyer's perspective. And so with our M&A experience, I think some of those data points, they're obvious to me because I look at firms every day, but they're very sort of, when a firm is unfocused, you can't see your way out of that spot very easily. And so we help people see their practice the way it really is, and then they can make really clear decisions about how to cut their hours, build capacity, break free from some of the work that's really anchoring them into their current situation. And so we start with a big, heavy dose of pruning, typically. So most of our members will go through, they'll prune their practice. Then they'll start looking really hard at pricing strategies. They'll look at their team and what they can delegate, get off of their plate, and then evolve more into the advisory space, if that's where they choose to go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you talk about pruning, let's start there. What are the biggest areas that you have people initially? Because I would assume, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm $1 million, you're coming in, I'm hoping you could tell me, okay, keep what you have and get bigger, right? And you're saying, no, let's prune. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I would guess that's true. Where are the main targets that you're initially saying, okay, here's what you're cutting?
Well, it depends on what they have, right? So what we have is we give them tools so they can look at what their practice is and they can make their own decisions about what they need to prune. So the data, it's a data-driven exercise. So for some people, I tell you, a common thing people prune is just the standalone 1040 tax return.
Okay. In person, right? Those are the worst. If they follow that with in person, everybody's just like, oh, not worth anything.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at like really your how many touches you have on that client, how much time is involved, how much seasonality is involved with that. Like if you look at all of these things, it's usually not, it's not priced where you're making money on that for most firms that size. And we did an analysis on, again, on the M&A side, we did a pretty thorough analysis just this year on firms, and we looked at days on the market, right? Like which firms are selling quickly, which firms are staying on the market for a long time, and what kind of patterns emerge from that analysis. And the pattern that probably jumped out the most was when we see a high number of personal tax returns in a practice, we see higher staff turnover, we see lower cash flow to owner percentages, and we see higher owner hours, and therefore more days on the market when it goes to sell, and lower multiples when it does sell. So that was the one thing that really popped out from that analysis.
Interesting.
Yeah, when we went through our journey was we got to about probably about $1 million or $2 million in revenue at the time, and then we were like, okay, how are we going to grow? So we can grow organically, which we're doing pretty well, and then we can do it through acquisition. We felt like we had our practice kind of a little bit under control. We thought, oh, let's entertain some acquisitions, and at the time we were brick and mortar, so we were in a physical location, so there's some boundaries there that we had to kind of adhere to, but we did stretch our legs a little bit and kind of started to look out. And I'll tell you what, time and time again, what we found with exiting firm owners where they were aging out, they worked 2,800 billable hours or 2,400 billable hours. Like whenever you did the math on all the 1040s they did, it's like, well, hell, you're paying to work there. You know what I mean? If you took your hourly rate times how many hours you worked and your profitability, like what you brought home, it's like you paid to have a staff around you doing a few of those things. And so after we looked under the hood of, probably 3 or 4 of those, we were just like, we put our hands up and we're like, we don't want to, take me to hire 2 to 3 people. And then because they did a lot of in-person work, now I had to replace a personality too in a relationship, which even makes it worse, right from the get-go. So
yeah. The good news though is that it's not that hard to fix once you know how to fix it. And I feel like the staffing challenges that people are facing right now are somewhat of a blessing in disguise because it's forcing people to like, oh gosh, I don't have any capacity. What's their first instinct? Oh, I need more people. Right. Right now they can't get those people. So they're having to think, okay, in that case, what do I do? And pruning and actually pruning, it's just like in your garden, you've got to prune, you've got to weed it. And if you don't, you're not going to get that next level growth until you do those things.
Yeah. So do you subscribe to the adage of you should be running a firm like you're preparing it for sale? I hear that quite a bit. And do you think that's a good way that people should have in their mind?
Absolutely. Because it just gives you a fresh perspective, if nothing else. I mean, if you have no intention of selling your firm, you should look at it from that perspective from time to time anyway, because the things that are going to make a buyer like your firm more are also going to be the things that make you like your firm more.
Sure.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's kind of like if you have a house, how many of you have had a house and you fix it up right before you put it on the market? Well, and then you think, gosh, if I had redone this kitchen 5 years ago, we could have enjoyed it, or if I had done this patio addition or whatever, I could have enjoyed it and then sold it and still gotten the value.
Yeah.
Same concept.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. What's interesting, and Brannon, I don't know how often you've ever Googled your name, but like we had this nice link to your website and everything, but I just, just typed in your name. By the way, don't do that. There's a lot of Brannon Poes that are like on parole, apparently. Just saying, so just
You're not
putting that out there.
Right?
No, I was making sure it wasn't the Brannon Poe. So I did get sucked into a video every now and again. But that aside, what I thought was kind of interesting, whenever I was looking at your profile on your website, is that, oftentimes you talk about you'll run into somebody talking about running an effective firm or exiting a firm, or starting a firm. And I saw the 2 books that you authored are kind of bookends, if you will. You have how to start your own CPA firm and then how to get out of it. So can you kind of walk us through that journey? Because I think a lot of the people that are listening to our podcast are folks that are just tired of industry. They worked at EY, they worked at Deloitte, and they're like, hey, there's a better way to do this. I want to be able to grow and start my practice. So if we could maybe just start with, some of the fundamentals and things that you've seen people really grow in, again, with that mentality of like, think of the end in mind, right from the beginning. Can you kind of walk us through some tips and tricks that you think that would be helpful for those people that are on the podcast that are really trying to just really grow their firm from the beginning?
Yeah. So to the books. So the first book I wrote was Accountant's Flight Plan, which was a little bit about exiting, but it was a lot about practice management that I had just learned through working with clients that were selling. And so that first book was written from the perspective of, I've just collected all these interesting practice management techniques from clients of ours. And somebody would, for example, someone would have a really good, high quality team that they didn't have to micromanage at all. And just people that kind of really took care of the firm and they got good margins that way. And so I just asked the seller, like, how did this come to be? Like, what was your secret to having this, outcome? And I was just taking notes, and then I had a lot of notes. I kept a little journal, and my wife said, you probably could write a book from this journal. And I was like, that's a really good idea. I probably should do that. And I did. And then it got picked up by the AICPA and was published as an ebook. And then they asked me to do a rewrite of On Your Own, How to Start Your Own Firm. So I wrote the second edition of that book, basically modernize it. I think it was originally written, the first edition was in the 90s or 80s even. So it was kind of old. I think there's a third edition now. Anyway, I think the practice management, the Accountant's Flight Plan is basically a practice management book, which is great if you're preparing your firm for an exit. But it's also great if you're building a firm. So I don't know that, like, a lot of the things that I write about are very fundamental. There's not like some secret magic tech stack or magic paint by numbers pricing strategy, or it's just kind of like foundational common sense stuff about running a business. That's, it's not that complicated, but people just don't spend the time and focus on it enough. I mean, you see that as CFOs, you see that with your business clients, right? If you can just get people to focus their attention there, they'll make progress. And it's the same thing with CPAs that own firms. But I think starting a firm has become very different with the technology. So when I wrote On Your Own, there weren't that many virtual firms in existence at that time. And so if I were going to rewrite that again, I would probably highly recommend people create a virtual practice instead of a brick and mortar practice.
Why is that?
The scalability. I mean, the hardest thing about starting a firm from scratch is it takes a while to get clients. If you're going to start a brick and mortar traditional practice, now I think there's a certain shortage of CPAs, so it might not be as hard as it was even 5 years ago, but it's just way easier to start a virtual firm because your geographical market is so much bigger. So you can do some pretty good digital marketing and probably start a practice faster than if you were going to start a brick and mortar.
Yeah, I mean, we're fully distributed. We believe that. I mean, it was for talent acquisition. And I know if you're starting your practice, you're not thinking about hiring people right away, but being able to hire outside of your market was important, being able to get clients all over the place. And in terms of increasing enterprise value, we talked about probably the biggest Achilles heel is, at least it was for us whenever we were looking at buying firms, was whenever we heard, what percentage is your in-house tax returns done? That's what would make us throw up in the back of our mouth. I would assume that you get the opposite whenever you're doing virtual, right? So the client's used to being in a virtual environment. So if I'm in Indiana and I buy a firm in Louisiana and they're used to working virtually, now I don't have to worry about the obstacle of not being able to go to the client's office or them come to me, right?
Right. No, absolutely. But I feel like even if you're starting a virtual firm, you've got to get the fundamentals right. Like if you don't have the right pricing strategy, you're not going to prosper.
Sure.
If you don't have the right client selection process or filtering, you're gonna suffer, right? And even as you do grow and you scale and you hire people, if you don't have a good hiring process, yeah, that's another skill set that people need to have or need to be able to employ people that have that skill set. It's a critical skill set. So all of those things of scaling, whether you're scaling really any business, those are the things that determine success.
You talked about the Accounting Practice Academy, and one thing that stuck with me, Brandon, that you said was, as you came in, you're talking to people about pruning and pricing. I think there might have been one other thing, and then you move into advising. And my guess is when you first started working with people, what they probably say is, I want to move into advising. And you're saying, do these things first. It might be obvious, but why do they need to do those couple things before they can move to advising?
Because they don't have the time and capacity to dedicate to it.
And so the pruning and pricing. Okay, that actually is different than what I thought you were going to say. Okay, do you say just a little bit more about that? That's how you free up the focus to be able to then implement that piece.
Yep. Most CPAs that haven't made a strategic plan to operate otherwise operate in a very chaotic fashion. They're working too many hours. They're working their staff too many hours. They're focusing on too many different lines of work. You know, if you have a CPA firm and you're doing 2 audits in a one owner firm, you are wasting your time.
Sure.
There's no way you're making money on 2 audits unless they're paying you $900,000 a year.
Yeah,
you
sure.
know?
That makes
Yep,
sense.
no, it makes a lot of sense.
You know, it's what was it? Adam Smith, one of the fundamental economic principles that he sort of was all about was like segregation of duties and specialization. That's the key to economic development. Is you can't be so scattered. You can't have a sole practice and have an audit practice, a wealth management practice, a tax practice, a bookkeeping firm, a payroll firm. You can't, unless you have a team. I shouldn't say it's the ownership. It's the team. If you don't have a team that's focused, like if you have let's say if you had an audit partner or a tax partner or a tax manager that you didn't have to worry about losing, then you could develop out lots of different specialties. But if you're a small firm and you're trying to scatter your service offerings too much, you will become unfocused and unprofitable.
That's
usually
really helpful. I'll just tell you where I thought you were going to go. And so this is a really helpful answer. What I thought you were going to say is then you can't scale if you're not doing it on top of a pruned and good pricing structure, right? You're going to go offer this new service. And if your house isn't in order, then that's going to be a mess. 2, the additional part that you mentioned that I like in part because Adam and I in our firm, we do coaching to other CPA firms who want to offer CFO practices. And it's really common that people want to go someplace. And if we were to check in with them like 6 months later, they're not nearly where they said they were going to be. And I think one of the questions we often don't ask is like, how much time are you devoting to this? And most likely it's very much what you're saying is, they're using spare time, which probably is either none up to maybe an hour or so a week. And so you could look and say, okay, so yeah, then 20 weeks, how would you expect to get really far? You've had no time to devote to this because it's spare time that no one feels like they have. So I like your answer there. That's really helpful.
Are you interested in offering virtual CFO services at your firm or scaling your existing service offerings? The Virtual CFO Playbook, How to Land $60,000 a Year Clients and Provide a Killer Client Experience, is an online series of modules that will equip you with essential tools for creating and delivering scalable VCFO services. These approaches have helped Summit CPA grow from $500,000 to upwards of $5 million in revenue over the past decade. If you're ready to grow your firm, visit summitcpa.net/VCFO Playbook to enroll now.
It's a little off topic, but something that I work with all my clients that I work with, and I personally use all the time. And Tom, I know you've heard me preach about it a million times over, is just 4 disciplines of execution. Yep. Like that book, I come back to that book probably 2 or 3 times a year. And the reason being is because, Brandon, it's everything that you just said. It is so simple. you feel stupid. Like after you read it, you're just like, well, duh. You know what I mean? There's no silver bullet there. It's just like fundamentals. But what it really hits on is everybody studies strategy and how to do this and how to do that. Nobody really studies execution, like what it takes to actually get something done. And so whenever we have somebody go to take the course, or I have a client that's kind of on the fence if they want to work with us, I like send them a little brief on 40X. And I'm like, if this gets you energized, if this gets you excited, then you would love to work with us. If it doesn't, then probably not your cup of tea, because we're really about getting intentional with the business and helping you execute on all those kind of things from a delivery standpoint. But again, also from, that same intentionality needs to come in your firm. And what I'm hearing you say, which I completely agree with, because that's whenever it matters, whenever you look under the hood, you have all these sexy metrics that you look at, like what's your average bill rate and what's your utilization, all these metrics that you look at. But ultimately, what's probably driving a lot of value that you see is operationally how you're set up, right? So Jody and I made a pretty conscious effort early on. I mean, don't get me wrong, we worked our ass off and we worked 80 hours a week, but we knew that wasn't the end goal. And what we did was we constantly made an investment back into the firm. So whenever we literally built out an org chart and knew like how big and how many people we'd have whenever we wanted to get to a certain spot. And whenever we'd pick up 2 or 3 clients, we'd be like, oh, halfway to the accounting director. Now it's ready to hire the accounting director. So we started filling those seats in with new clients. Now, what sucked for us is, you jump $1 million in revenue and you've reinvested all that back into roles. But ultimately what that led us to was, by the time we made our exit in April of this last year, if they ask us like, hey, what happens if Jody or Adam go away? Nothing. You know what I mean? We had a very high functioning team. Don't get me wrong, like we bring our own value in different ways, but as far as executing the day to day and making sure everything stays on, level set and going, like we had a very high functioning team. So that was kind of our process as well, was just focusing on the operations and the SOPs and making sure that Jody and I were less and less valuable. And that's why we intentionally made it like Summit CPA, right? Instead of Grundon and Hale or something like that. Is because, and I know that some states with law firms and you got to put your name in it and that kind of stuff, but we intentionally did that because also whenever we went to a client, we didn't want them to know that there was only 2 of us. Right out of the gate, there could have been 2 of us or 200 of us. They didn't know. We're Summit CPA Group. So we always wanted to look bigger than what we were. And then we always didn't want it to be contingent upon like, oh, I'm talking to the founder, because that, again, would detract value. Do you see that in other firms that you're working with?
I do. I mean, I think the fact that you guys really focused on people and you got to a place of where you could slowly let go is, in some ways, that's a counterintuitive strategy, right? I think especially when you start a firm or you're early in the firm, or maybe an acquisition, you sort of instinctively think, well, gosh, if I'm going to grow, I have to do more, right? I have to do more sales work. I have to do more client work. I have to do more. And actually, it's sort of the opposite. You have to, at some point, that's true, that you do have to do more. But then when you want to scale, then you have to say, I got to do less. What can I do? What can someone else do for me? And so growing is a process of actually letting go of things. And the more the more you grow, the more you let go of. And that requires really good team building skills, right? That's acquiring the right talent, investing your time and resources into developing that talent and being able to let go. I mean, you got to have somebody to delegate to, right?
Well, right. And a lot of times it's an ego trip a little bit too. Everybody wants to throw on their cape and go in and save the day, that kind of a thing. So it does take a little bit, you have to swallow your pride a little bit whenever you are coaching and delegating work to others, not to be like, oh, nope, get out of my way. I mean, I think that's kind of the curse of professional service firms in general, whether you're talking about a law office or you're talking about, there's how can you coach many people to do what you do as opposed to you being the one all be all for your specific thing. So we talk a lot about that. And again, it was a little bit of a painful experience for us because scaling's difficult, especially whenever you're giving it all back to new hires. But we had the intent of growing for that purpose and then eventually looking to exit. And we knew that that would kind of increase our intrinsic value the more, the less reliant the business was really on us,
Yeah, absolutely. And that strategy worked out really well for you guys.
Yeah, no, yep, absolutely. So what about, so I know people still though are interested in those sexy metrics that we were talking about, right? Like, so what are you seeing in the marketplace today? What are some of the numbers and the things that I know just in general, they always talk about top line growth. If you want to maximize value, 10 to 20% year over year growth, there's a certain bottom line percentage. Or, it used to be firms always, you could count on it. Firms always sold for 1 to 1.25 times revenue. And a lot of times it's 1.1 because the 10% was the commission for the broker. And that was just kind of like par for the course. And then it feels like over the last like 5 or 6 years, everybody's kind of converted to, if they're really small, like an SDE multiple, if they're bigger, an EBITDA multiple. What are you seeing, and what are some of those benchmarks for people to be able to kind of maximize their, their exit?
Well, so what we tell people in APA, of course, we keep it simple. I mentioned to you, it's like we focus on the fundamentals, keep it simple. So we have 4 KPIs that we think any small CPA firm owner should track. And those 4 KPIs are really simple.
I'm going to
cash flow to owner.
Okay. You say cash flow is first, right?
Cash flow to owner, right? Top line revenue, head count, just raw head count. And then lastly, your number of days off, owner days off.
Owner days off.
And a day off, and a day off means you're not working at all. You're completely unplugged. You're not checking a single email, taking a single phone call. So those are the four things that we tell you. Track those things, you'll see amazing progress in your firm. If you track 20 things, if everything's important, then nothing's important. So pick what you want to really focus on. I tell people in that 1 to 5 million range, cash flow to owner, the goal should be 50%. Now, I do see there's usually a fall off. You get to about 3 million, that cash flow owner percentage is going to generally decline. It's probably going to go down to 35 to 40%, just because there's not as much owner production. So it's sort of natural to get about a $2.5 to $3 million mark. You're going to see a little bit of decline in owner cash flow percentage. Time off, like, super important, because if you're trying to sell your firm, a buyer, like you said, Adam, you see these practitioners just working crazy hours. People don't want that. That's a business that's too dependent on the owner. And culturally, I think people really, CPAs aren't working those old school hours anymore. Some are, but I think the majority of buyers that I talk to are very turned off.
What do you
by
like
that.
to see then?
And
what do you like
changed.
to see for the owner's days off then, Brannon?
I like to see under 2,000 total hours a year.
Okay. And then how much of that do you usually target for chargeable, or do you?
I don't recommend people figure that. Like, if you're looking at cash flow to owner, it doesn't matter how much is chargeable and how much is not. The less chargeable, the better for an owner.
Okay.
I wrote this piece with Rob Siegfried. Are you familiar with Rob? He's got a pretty big consulting firm, and he's a CPA that started from scratch. And his goal was to get to 0 billable hours after about 12 years of firm ownership. And people at the time, he had other managing partners of much bigger firms say, "You're crazy. You don't have to get down to 0 billable hours. It doesn't take that much time to manage a practice." And anyway, he said, my time is better spent developing my people, covering risk of my practice, and growing the firm and working on growth. And that, was in his mind the most essential 3 things that he could do for the business. So I don't think tracking, I'm a big value pricing proponent. I don't think anybody should. I don't know why anybody would track time, honestly. Maybe you can use it for productivity, but if you think about the people that report to you, you kind of know if they're productive, regardless of what their timesheet says, right? And if you don't, then you're just not paying attention at all.
We do value pricing and track time. I have found it valuable as I look back on my own time in certain clients, and I can look at how much we charge them my time. And you're probably not surprised there are some clients that are disproportionate. And that's had me look and say, okay, what do I need to be doing differently? Because I'm spending way too much time for this client compared to someone else. And I've been able to make some changes. And in some cases, looking saying maybe this is a client that really isn't a fit for what we're trying to do, or we should change pricing. So I found that valuable from our side. I could at the same time, if one of my team members says, hey, I'm completely swamped, that would be one of the places we could look and say, well, what's taking your time? And is there something we can do around that? So I think it can be a useful analytical tool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I for my management style, I just, I don't find it valuable. And I think, from a pricing standpoint, it's really something. I agree with Ron Baker's philosophy that it should just be left behind.
Yeah. No, we actually just listened to Ron, and I know Jody's been on his podcast a few times, and Jody talks with him a lot. We kind of agree with Ron. We agree with him differently. Like we believe in the value-based billing, and he had to recently kind of change up his methodology and his thinking too. Like he's done a reboot on, the practicality of his original assumptions of what value-based billing was. And it kind of aligns more with what we do in terms of like subscription-based billing. But I think that and I'm totally down for it, and I can't wait for the day that it actually makes sense. But some of the stuff that you would measure is just kind of pie in the sky, for us. And as Tom said, and this is the great debate in the space, right? We use the time entries for very high level stuff. So if Tom comes to me and says, man, I'm just stressed out, I can't take any more clients, because we measure based on book of business, value based. Tom, you should be able to run $1 million book. What's going on, buddy? And then I look at his time, and what we find is a couple things. Number one, for being able to price those value-based services, there's been time and time again that we would say this service is absolutely killing us. Processing customer invoices is the worst thing in the face of the earth, because that's what we are going to get in trouble the most for. And then, but doing like bank recs is probably, we're making hand over fist money. And then whenever you looked at the items, it's like, oh, actually, it's the complete opposite. We make the most money doing AR because we charge a premium for it because we hate it. And then we discount the value of a bank rec, and it takes us a lot of time. And so we do it to measure kind of pricing, and we just kind of look at it from 10,000 feet and look for trends. We win some, lose some whenever you do value-based billing, right? But we look for trends in job profitability just to kind of see where we're at. And then again, just only if somebody comes to us and they're just like, hey, I am absolutely swamped. It's like, well, which client's killing you? And a lot of times what Tom would say is, I hate working with ABC client. They're consuming my life. And then you look at their timesheet and you're like, you're spending about an hour a month on them. Like, what's going on? Like, you're spending 15 hours a month on this other client that we charge half as much money. Like, oh, but I like working with them. You know what I mean? So there's always like this, like very, so that's a very like dramatic example, but time and time again, we see that whenever you ask a person. So we don't use it to like beat anybody over the head or look at utilization and realization and drive business results. So we agree and totally in that regard. And same with the value based. We just haven't been able to fundamentally get away from the emotional side of people saying, I'm tired, and then point to the wrong thing, or us say we're valuing this correctly, and then come to find out we're not. You know what I mean? Like we haven't been able to take the emotion out of the determination of whether or not we're doing good. That's always kind of my pitch back to anybody that's like, I don't want to, trust me, we don't want to track time either, but those are the only things that, that we find challenging, especially whenever you've got, 70, 80, 100 employees, it becomes a lot more difficult.
Right. And I think that's perfectly valid with larger teams, but, with most of our clients in that 1 to 5 million range, they don't have extremely large teams. So there tends to be a sense of it's a little easier to put your finger on the problem without the timesheet, in my opinion.
Do you find that to be an obstacle if you did run into somebody like that? Like, so if I'm a buyer, I'm coming in, I would imagine any partner meeting I've ever been in, what's their realization? How many billable hours do they have? So if you're selling a business that doesn't track time and you're selling them to, a client, and the client's like, cool, give me the rundown. How many charge hours do they have? How many, and you're like, oh, they don't have any of that stuff. Is that a problem?
Happens. No, it happens all the time because a lot of firms don't have that stuff, especially for the owner. Like the owners, they might, the staff might track time, but the owner might not track time.
Right.
I mean, we just go back to the fundamentals. Like, look at the cash flow. Look at the owner hours. Like, look at the main metrics. And usually, if those metrics are really good, then those details tend to not matter so much.
Do you mind filling in, Brandon? Then I imagine people are listening said, okay, there were 4 key metrics. What are they? And we haven't talked about top line revenue or head count. Do you mind filling in those two? And that way people feel like they know what they're looking at.
Sure. So, top line revenue, when you're going for a sale, growth is definitely a positive. You want to see, like, what I find that makes buyers most comfortable is there's a steady sort of consistent pattern of growth. Fast growth can scare people sometimes, in that, easy come, easy go, I think is the mindset there. If the client's not that old or hasn't been with the firm that long, then they might not be as sticky as a client that's been there longer. And there's some truth to that. So I think in terms of growth, I think you want to see, steady growth.
And then head count.
In terms of head count, I think that's just an important track for your own observation. I think if you're going for a sale, if you're understaffed right now, that's a negative. If you're overstaffed right now, that's great because most buyers probably need the capacity. So
is that measured in terms of revenue per head count, under or overstaffed? Or how does someone say this is, it's a $4 million firm, they're under or overstaffed?
Well, I've seen a lot of variation in staff size and revenue per person. I saw an interesting, Vern Harnish speak at an EO event a few months ago. And he had this really interesting kind of general statistic about revenue per person. And I may not get the numbers exactly right, but I'm going to get them pretty close. So I'll ask you, what do you think is the average revenue for a small company, like an under 10 million company? What do you think the average revenue per person
for everyone in the firm?
For everyone in the firm, just not a CPA firm, a general, this is like general small business statistics.
Oh, probably 100,000 per head count, if it's not a professional service firm, I guess professional service, I would probably say 150. If it's not a professional service, then I would probably, it's probably sub 100,000 would be
I would
guess.
have said about 200 before I heard Brandon's answer, so I won't.
Yeah, I think it's closer to what you said, Tom. I think the number that Vern quoted was around 200. Guess what it is for a large company?
Should go up with their synergies. Should be higher, but my guess is it's not.
This is
true. Is it?
It's a lot higher. It's like 600. Yeah. And I found that to be that really is a head scratcher. Like, how is that? Because you think there's different, there's mid-level management layers. There's a lot of structure. So I found that was interesting. I think a CPA firm should be around 200, 250.
200 to 250? Wow. So what we're finding is, I think in the CAS, they just came out with a study. I think the average CAS practice, which is advisory, I think is right around 125,000 people.
Oh.
And this only has 67 firms. We're at the DCPA. Kind of to your point, whenever we're talking and looking at some of these metrics, it's just a different way to look at business, especially whenever you're looking at the median result was 121,000. Okay. Yeah. And so the top performers were 231. So a pretty big delta between the top performers and the other ones. But I think, and that was at the CAS benchmark survey from CPA.com that just came out like a month ago. Pretty interesting stats there. But I think what was funny is I had this marketing guy come on, and he was talking to me about, hey, how do I market to CPA firms? I just want to focus solely on CPA firms. I'm like, oh, cool. He goes, I go, what's your target market? And he's like, I want to work with, probably above 50 employees, CPA firms is kind of what I'm thinking. And I said, hey, by chance, marketing guy, did you do your research? And he's like, oh yeah. I was like, how many accounting firms there are in the US? And he's like, I don't know. I was like, about 45, 46,000. And, his eyes light up and he's like super excited. And I go, like the 500th largest firm only has 20 employees. So like whenever you look on the CPA's top 400 or the top 500, there's mega giants in the top 4, and then 5 to 30 are also just massive. And then you get to even the top 100 and they have 300 employees, and you're the top 100 out of 46,000 firms in the US. The 500th largest firm has like 20 to 25 employees and is like right around $3 million. So most of the CPA firms that are operating out of there, sub 20 people, and probably living somewhere from that $500,000 to $1.5 million in revenue. Do you find that quite a bit whenever you're like people coming to you? Like, what's a normal size when people are trying to exit? Do you go off of like different metrics? If they're sub 1 million, do you not really work with people that are sub 1 million? How does that happen?
So we, our typical client, I think our average on the sales side is probably about 800 or 900K.
Okay.
On average. On our APA side, it's probably about just over 1 million, maybe 1.1, 1.2.
Okay.
The firms that we work with.
So those are 4 or 5 person firms. Does
So
that sound about right? If you're at 800, 900,000. Okay.
Yep. 4 or 5 person firms. And it's interesting though, because I've seen some really high performing firms. I sold a one owner firm that was doing almost 3 million a few years ago.
Right.
And,
there can be exceptions for sure.
Yeah. There's just there's a lot of variety in just the performance of these firms. It's all
what do
over
you
the place.
think are some of the biggest myths about selling when someone comes to you? And I assume they say, hey, here's what I heard. Like Adam said, it's this kind of multiple. Do you hear several things that are pretty common myths where you're like, that's not really what you're going to find?
Yeah, people think they have to, people think when they're selling, they have to take all the risk. In other words, they sell on an earn-out basis. And that's a common myth. And the truth is you'll find buyers that'll buy that way for sure. I mean, that's not a bad deal for the buyer, but there's also really good financing in the marketplace. There's a lot of lenders that focus on CPA firm acquisition loans. And so and the success rate of those loans is good. So they like to do those deals. So there's 10-year financing. If you own a firm, often you can get 100% financing over a 10-year period. So I think that's one.
So if somebody
myth.
wants an earn out, you say, hey, don't worry. I'm going to go talk to Brannon because I know there are people out there that are going to bankroll this for you. Don't worry. Because there's no reason to just accept it because that's what you hear everybody does. What about the multiple? Are you usually seeing it as a multiple of this cash flow to owner, or are you seeing it more of like a percentage of sales? How are you usually valuing those?
It's still a multiple of revenue, top line revenue. And, I've done a lot of thinking about why that is. And I think it's because the practice is malleable. In other words, the owner determines the results of the firm. And we've had a number of examples where I had one example in particular. This was really interesting, where I had a firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the cash flow to owner was about 60, maybe even 65% on an 800K firm, one owner firm. So it was a high performing firm. And the buyer was from another state, And he had a CPA firm out of state that he sold, and he was operating at about a 40% cash flow to owner. And then fast forward, and what's interesting is the seller ended up buying another firm through us in another city. And so we got to watch this little pattern play out both ways. The buyer who bought the high-performing firm, I came back to him 5-6 years later. Guess what his margin was? It's about 40%. The new firm. The guy that sold bought a lower-performing firm, but guess where it was 5 years later?
Right. Yeah.
60-65%. So who owns the firm is really going to determine the results over time.
Okay. Yeah, but still small, right? Like, so for instance, I can't impact a $10 million firm profitability as an owner like I could 800,000. Because like I said, what I would find most of the time and what I would argue or want to see with that person that all of a sudden turned it into 60 or 65, I'd be, okay, now you don't work. Let's see who has more days off and who doesn't work. What we found always is that person that hustled for the 60 to 65%, they were charging a premium and they were doing it all themselves. I get $500 an hour. So I go out there and I just bill like crazy. I like working on Sundays and at 9 o'clock at night. And then the other guy's like, nope, push it down. You know what I mean? Like, so we took more of the reduction to put people in place because we wanted to build. I mean, those things to me, and that's why I say, and I think that's the reason why whenever you say there's 46,000 accounting firms and there's only 500 that have more than 20 employees, I think it's because as a professional service firm, we really struggle with the idea of leverage and treating it like a normal business. We have to do it like based on our backs. And then, and then that's why also if you have 20 or 30 people, you also have a 5 or 6 person partner. You know what I mean? It's like, why do you have 10 people and 4 partners? Like in what world
and I
does
think
that
a lot of
exist?
times, I mean, that brings up a really interesting problem. And I see this, I've known about this problem for a long time, and I really don't know that there's a good solution for it. But what happens is when you have multiple partners, somebody is going to be very change resistant, most likely. And so it's really important, like who has veto power in your partner group. If you're trying to change a practice, if you're trying to scale a practice, that's risky. It's kind of messy. And so if you've got a partner that's vetoing change and vetoing that growth, you're not going to get very far. And that is a common problem. So as people partner up, as they scale, and you get 3 or 4 partners, my experience has been somebody's going to be risk averse, somebody's going to be change resistant, and they're going to veto everything, and the whole thing just kind of, tops
and
out.
as you talk, I think seamless succession is one of your, is it product or sort of the mode you guys work in? Is that right?
It's
Okay,
what we've named our
you.
process.
So
the
I'm
seamless
curious,
succession.
when someone sells, is there a typical amount that owner stays on and continues working for that seamless part where you end up saying, okay, yeah, so if they're a personality that doesn't match with the buyer, this is a real problem?
Well, I think getting the right fit is really job one when you go to sell. So if that doesn't work, that's probably a problem no matter how long the transition is going to be. Most of our transitions, now this gets tailored some depending on the complexity of the client work and the capacity of the firm. And there are a lot of variables that can impact the transition time. But like in an ideal scenario for us, for a $1 to $5 million firm, 2 to 4 months is what we recommend.
That makes a lot of sense.
So pretty quick. Yeah. But that requires you finding a very capable buyer, right? You need to find someone who can, we just sold a $2 million firm in Georgia in October, and the transition was like a month, maybe even less.
Quick.
Buyer was like, I'm good. You can go now.
Brandon, as we work toward wrapping this up, I'm curious for the listener out here who's thinking, maybe sometime I would, what would your advice be for at what point someone should call you, maybe timing wise, and when it makes sense to contact you versus maybe a do-it-yourself or a different type of person?
Okay, so I think ideally, if we can start the conversation 3 to 5 years before the
Probably
sale,
longer than most people
that's
would think, I would guess, for the person thinking that. Okay.
Well, I mean, if their practice needs, a lot of times people come to me and they say, well, how much is my practice worth? Right. And so I give them my sort of understanding of that value. And if they don't like that value, then given enough time, they've got time to work on that. Right. So, and that's kind of where Accounting Practice Academy came in, is we saw that people sometimes needed to get their practice in a better position so they could sell for the price they needed to get it closed. As far as the do-it-yourself, I think internal sales are often do-it-yourself. What I do is not rocket science, but we have a large stable of buyers. We have a process that helps people determine the right fit. We market the firm very professionally so that we are able to capture the strengths of the firm and even the weaknesses of the firm, and that helps find the better fit. I tell people, like, hey, if you're going to sell your house, do you want one buyer or do you want 10? What do you think is going to help you get the best fit and the best price? So it's somewhat of a numbers game, and that's where our marketing, our time in the marketplace. We've just built a big database of buyers. And if you put your practice on the market with us, you're going to get a lot of exposure and you're going to get a nice process to help maximize the value.
Oh yeah.
We also offer transition guidance. So that's another big value add, is just how do we tell the clients? How do we nurture the staff relationships? What do we need to focus on during that transition period?
Yeah, my experience would be always get a broker involved. I mean, just everything that you just said, and then plus some. I mean, just the experience, running interference, being able to get a better deal. They're usually worth their weight in gold. So.
Even some to just take the emotion out, right? When it's my baby, I've grown, and I have to think, how do I improve it? Someone else who can look at it and just say, here are the facts, is worth a ton. Most people have a really hard time with that. Yeah. Well, Brannon, thank you very much. This has really been helpful, and I think to a lot of people looking wherever they are in that journey, especially when say 3 to 5 years out for them, this is probably really valuable. Even if it's, I'm not going to sell, like you said, some of the best run firms are the ones being run like you're planning to sell it, because that's what makes it a good firm and more fun to run in. So thank you. Adam, thanks as always for helping facilitate the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. We could probably go 2 sessions on this one pretty easy. So thanks for coming and joining us, Brannon.
Yeah,
have a great
glad
day.
to come back.
Thanks.
Enjoy this podcast? Visit our website at summitcpa.net to get more tips and strategies for achieving modern CPA firm success. We're here to be a resource in this ever-changing industry.